Hi everyone. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the ChemPhys section of the newly released AAMC practice exam and kind of giving my take on what was tested in that section. So like I mentioned in my overview, the overall ChemPhys section did feel very representative to what the AAMC says they're going to test, both in terms of content and in skills. One notable change is that there was a few more questions in the 4A physics section, so work, energy, translational motion, pulleys, but overall very similar to what we've seen in other exams. In terms of what's focused on within the content categories, I will say that there was definitely a major focus on biomolecular structures. So I'm talking functional groups, common names, funky ring structures like chiral rings, and definitions of aromatic heterocycles. Absolutely knowing your amino acids, sugars, and protein structures, as well as a few lipid structures. Very basic, but they were there. And even things that I was not quite expecting, such as structures of the electron transport chain. So I would say when it comes to biomolecular structures, know them really well, be very comfortable with what they look like and how we name them. Other than that, I didn't see a ton of organic reaction questions. There were definitely a couple passages that included organic reactions, but in terms of detailed questions about substitution reactions or aldol condensation, I didn't really see that much at all. Not to say that they won't be possibly tested on your exam, but I do think there's a trend of moving away from detailed organic reaction questions and focusing more on, do you understand the basic structures and basic rules behind organic reactivity? So I would say definitely focus more on like the Orgo 1 side of things. We're focusing on chirality, reactivity, what makes a molecule want to react or not, and then of course structures, and not spend as much time or not as much emphasis on complicated mechanisms or organic reactions. To wrap up the organic component was lab techniques. I've talked about this before. Lab techniques are a huge part of this exam. Even if they're not directly tested in a question, they definitely show up in passages, and that was true in this exam as well. Notables are column chromatography. There was a decent number of questions on that, and extractions, alongside spectroscopy and using light in order to analyze different structures. So definitely make sure that you're brushed up on your lab techniques and you're comfortable reading passages about those lab techniques and making decisions about when you would use one technique over another given an experimental setup. Finally, in physics, all your usual suspects were there. Nothing crazy, but there were definitely some math questions, lots of unit conversions, lots of dimensional analysis, making sure that you know your molar conversions, know kilograms to grams, right? All of those things were there, had to use them. There was definitely an emphasis on capacitors. That's one I would definitely focus on. And then light, but basics about light, like E equals HF, wavelength versus frequency, and knowing your different wavelengths of the visible light spectrum. All right, so a lot of basics about light, a lot of basics about capacitors and circuits, not too much about fluids. And again, those 4A questions were largely calculation-based about force, work, energy, and simple machines. My final note on physics is that I did notice there were some tricky setups where I really had to go through all of what I call my math steps to make sure I didn't miss anything, miss any keyword or key number, make sure I understood exactly what they wanted me to do in a question. So I definitely had to work slowly through those physics questions to make sure that I had all the information I needed. So when you're practicing physics, make sure to take your time, gather the information that you need, because there's not that much that's complicated, but there are a lot of things that you need to answer a question correctly. Finally, in the world of general chemistry, it was so core concept. There was a decent number of molar mass calculations and understanding atoms in terms of like neutrons and protons and electrons. Weirdly, no radioactive decay, but that I still put that in like a definitely review category. In the acid-base chemistry world, being very comfortable with your pKa, pKb conversions and understanding what would make something an acid or a base, what would protonate or deprotonate something in solution, versus a lot of details about titrations or things like that. So again, keep saying this over and over, but it felt like a lot of core concepts that were tested. Finally, in Gen Chem, there were a decent amount of thermodynamics questions, again, basics, and enzymatic kinetics questions that overlapped with biochemistry. That they had a lot of detail on. So in addition to being very familiar with your structures, know everything there is to know about how enzymes work, right? How they work, what they do to a reaction, what metrics we use to describe them, what they look like on graphs, right? There's definitely a lot of enzyme questions, so you'll want to brush up and feel very comfortable with that category. From a research and data perspective, like I mentioned in the overview, there were definitely a decent amount of tables that I found relatively confusing. Some that brought in some microbiology concepts, but really we're asking more about the numbers of the table. There were definitely funky unit conversions, so checking your units on that data in the figures and data as well. There were some basic organic structures, and then there were a couple funky lab design descriptions and visuals, especially in answer choices and questions. So again, pretty typical. I would say that a lot of that data felt similar to the section bank questions on the AAMC. So good ones to practice with. About 10 of the questions in the ChemPhys section required only test-taking ability. No content required, just pure, are you reading the passage? Are you reading the figures correctly? So I definitely encourage you to spend a lot of time on doing test prep problems, making sure that you're very solid about reading the passage and getting the right information, because there was a good chunk of questions that only required that and no content knowledge at all. So overall, I'm pretty happy about the ChemPhys section. I think it's a return to core concepts instead of them asking you to memorize a lot of nuancy things. We're going to talk a little bit more in the biochem analysis about the overlap of biochem in this section, because there definitely was some biochem topics, particularly metabolic structures. But overall, guys, just make sure when you're studying, study each content category basics first, foundation up. Worry about those details later on in your prep. All right, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this video, and happy studying.